Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just gonna get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so, just down below. If you like the content you see, don't forget to give a like. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's a comment section down there as well for all of that. Today we are diving back into the Ghostly Echoes series. We had been working our way through British Columbia, so now we are going east. We're skipping over Alberta because we already did that one, and we are diving into the ghost stories of Saskatchewan. So I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place close to Regina, Saskatchewan. The Crawling Coat. In 1932, there were two sisters living in a small house on the outskirts of Regina. They both worked for the same employer, a pharmacist, who owned a small drugstore and confectionery. The sisters had very different personalities, however, and made very different employees. The younger girl, Harriet, was honest and trustworthy. The elder one, Maura, tended to be sneaky and selfish. Every day that she worked in the store, she took a little money for herself out of the cash drawer. Even worse, this forced Harriet, who never wanted to be a thief, to do the same thing. If she didn't, she was sure that the pharmacist would notice the glaring differences between their daily receipts and have Maura arrested. Harriet agonized over what she had to do to protect her sister and refused to keep the money. Maura ended up with all of it, and suffered no guilt whatsoever. For weeks the scam continued until Maura became concerned about having so much cash hidden under her mattress. If anyone ever found her nest egg, it would be extremely difficult to explain. She looked around the little two-room shack and found a suitable bank for her booty. It was a lovely black wool coat that she and Harriet had pooled their earnings to buy. When the weather was cold, the girls took turns wearing it. It was an arrangement that generally worked very well, as they worked on alternate days. This was an extremely warm March day, however, and Harriet had gone off to work wearing only a sweater. Maura thought it would be ideal to hide her fortune in the lining of the garment. Delighted with the idea, she found a pair of scissors and began to snip away at the stitches. By the time Harriet arrived home that evening, Maura had finished the task and carefully sewed the lining back into the coat. She said nothing to Harriet, thinking that it would be better if her highly moral little sister remained ignorant about what she was wearing on her back. The next day it was Maura's turn to work at the store. The mercurial March weather had turned cold again overnight, so she took the black coat down from its usual peg by the door. As Maura slipped it over her shoulders, she noted that it had a slightly different feel. The bills are just a little crisp, she thought. They'll soften up with time. She felt fairly certain that Harriet, who knew nothing of the impromptu alteration, would not notice the subtle difference. By the time Maura had arrived at the confectionery, however, she was no longer sure that the difference was so subtle. Several times she had to tug the coat down over her hips, because the fabric seemed to be riding up her body, and she was positive that the collar was now sitting differently. Something about it made the hair on the back of her neck stand up with static electricity. Even the sleeves, which had been perfect before, wanted to bunch up oddly around Maura's elbows. At the store, she was happy to take the uncomfortable coat off, but was worried about what Harriet would think the next time she wore it. Maura mulled the problem over throughout the workday. By closing time, she had a solution. Believing that it was best to deal with the problem offensively, Maura assumed a pouty expression before walking into the little house that night. "Did you have this coat cleaned?" she asked Harriet accusingly. Harriet shook her head no. "Well, there's something wrong with it. Maybe the damp has ruined it, but it just doesn't feel comfortable anymore." Maura flung the coat onto its peg and walked off to the bedroom in a dramatic huff. certain that she had handled any potential problems. Now, when Harriet put the coat on, she wouldn't be surprised by the odd fit. What surprised Maura the next day was that Harriet didn't notice any difference in the garment. "I can't think of what you mean about it bunching up," the younger sister shrugged, then added gently, "Perhaps you've just put on a pound or two, Mo." Maura simply sniffed. Later she realized that she should be pleased that Harriet was so sure the coat was fine. Somehow the whole thing bothered her, however. It bothered her enough that late that night, when her sister was fast asleep, Maura tiptoed out of the bedroom and tried the coat on over her nightgown. It made her flesh crawl. When she had last worn it, she had been rushing to work and was able to discern her movement from that of the cloth now. Now, as she stood still in the darkened room, she could feel the coat writhing over so slightly on her body. Repulsed, she shrugged it off and let it fall on the floor. Without bothering to hang the coat up on the wall again, she went back to bed. "I'm either crazy or having a nightmare," she thought. In the morning, when watery spring sunshine filtered through the thin curtains and woke her, Maura decided that the nightmare explanation made most sense. The coat may have become ill-fitting, but it certainly couldn't have taken on a life of its own. Maura held this opinion for about 5 seconds until she swung her feet out of bed and placed them on the floor. They landed on wool. As Maura recoiled in disgust, she knew that she had not experienced a nightmare. She really had tried the coat on during the night and felt it moving slyly over her skin. She really had dropped it on the floor by the front door, and now she knew it. While she slept, it had been creeping ever closer to her. She dared not wonder what might have happened if she had slept an hour longer. There was a hairbrush sitting on the bedside table, and Maura used it to pick up the coat gingerly from the floor. Holding it out at arm's length, she proceeded carefully to the other room and deposited the foul thing on a hook. Satisfied that it would not be able to squirm down from its perch, Maura felt secure enough to turn her back on it while she got ready for work. As she was stoking a fire to warm the little rooms, Harriet came out of the bedroom yawning. "I'm glad I caught you before you left," she said to Maura. "There was something I needed to tell you last night." Harriet then went on to warn Maura that she would have to stop skimming the cash box at the confectionery. The pharmacist was changing his method of bookkeeping and would now be sure to notice if the revenue and the inventory didn't match up. "It's for the best," Harriet lectured. "You shouldn't have been taking it anyway." Maura was too preoccupied to argue, just nodded mutely. She thought it too bad that her supplemental income had come to an end, but consoled herself with the knowledge that she at least had her savings. It appeared that her method of storing the money would have to change, but at least it was there. It was a comfort. A few minutes later, Maura pulled on a faded old coat and prepared to leave for work. "You'll be cold in that," advised Harriet. "Take the black wool." Maura mumbled that it just didn't suit her anymore, and she preferred to be blue with the cold than to wear something so ill-fitting. In an obviously black mood, she left, slamming the door behind her. All that day, as Maura traded licorice whips for pennies and listened to old ladies complain about the fact that you couldn't buy a good health tonic anymore, she worked on her problem. It was obvious, she thought, that the money must be taken out of the coat's silky lining. She would find another place to keep her stash, perhaps under a floorboard or beneath the heavy trunk, which was never moved. Then, with any luck, the coat would go back to just being a coat, and not some grotesque thing that felt like a swarm of insects on her skin. Maura shuddered to think of it, and looked forward to accomplishing her task on the next warm day when Harriet would leave the house without wearing the coat. That evening she returned home to find Harriet waiting for her. The younger sister was beaming with pleasure over something, and had even prepared a little bit of supper for the two of them. "I have a surprise for you, Mo," she said, and invited Maura to take a seat at the chipped kitchen table. "Wait here." With that, Harriet raced off into the other room. In a moment she was back and modeling a lovely, stylish tan coat. There were tortoiseshell buttons decorating the pockets and a smart little faux fur trim at the collar. "That's beautiful," Maura said sincerely, "but it's not like you to spend your money on clothes." "Well, it's for you," Harriet spoke excitedly, then explained. "For us, that is. I thought we could share it. You just seem to dislike the black coat so much now, and I wanted to do something nice for you, so here we are. I even bought it just a little roomier than the other," she finished discreetly, then shrugged the coat off her shoulders and offered it to Moira to try on. Moira rose from the table and took the lovely wrapped in her hands. It was beautiful and looked so warm. She slipped it on over her drab uniform and stepped back to view herself in the mirror. I looked marvelous, she thought. Harriet chattered away happily behind her, apparently expressing that very opinion. Moira turned and preened in the mirror for several minutes, then suddenly was hit with a thought. "How did you pay for this?" she demanded of Harriet. The girl looked pleased that she had asked. "Moira, that's the best part," she said. "It didn't cost a dime. I just took the black wool to that second-hand clothing store downtown and made a trade. The clerk was so happy because there was a woman shopping in the store who bought her old coat straight away. Isn't that great?" Moira heard herself faintly saying, "Yes, great," as she felt the color drain from her cheeks. Once more she looked in the mirror. It was a beautiful coat that she was wearing, but it couldn't hide the stoop in her posture or the bitterness in her eyes. It was a gorgeous coat, thought Moira, and unlikely to make the hair on her arms stand up in revulsion. But somehow that wasn't enough. If she wore this coat for the next 40 years, it would never be worth what she had paid for it. In the lining of the black wool had been over $200. This story takes place in Beachy, Saskatchewan. The Mentalist and the Murder Case. It was December 10th, 1932, and the little movie theater in Beachy, Saskatchewan was beginning to hum with life. Outside, ice crystals hung in the air, and the sound of feet crunching over hard-packed snow could be heard as people approached the building. Inside, everyone chatted and laughed and was flushed with anticipation. It was not a movie they had come to see, nor the Christmas pageant, though there were a few cheerful handmade decorations lending their festive appeal. This night, the people of the small community north of Swift Current had gathered to witness a live performance by the mind reader who billed himself as Professor Gladstone Mentalist. The audience was hoping for a night of excitement and drama. They would not be disappointed. The lights were dimmed and a hush fell over the auditorium. Professor Gladstone appeared on the stage. He was tall and gray-haired, with the distinguished appearance and dramatic flair necessary for one in his profession. For nearly an hour, the audience sat rapt as the traveling psychic astounded and amused them with his uncanny powers. Then, in the middle of his act, Professor Gladstone seemed to falter. For several long seconds, the man stopped performing. People began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, and a low murmur spread through the crowd. It stopped when Gladstone suddenly straightened and fixed his piercing gaze upon a local rancher named Bill Taylor. "You were thinking of your friend Scotty McLaughlin," the mind reader boomed. "He was murdered, brutally murdered." The townspeople sat in shocked silence. Scotty McLaughlin had been a popular fellow who had once farmed in the area. 3 years before, Professor Gladstone brought his show to the small town. McLaughlin had been talking about leaving. He had plans to sell his share of the farm to his partner, John THRU, and then take the night train to British Columbia. On January 16, 1930, the planned evening McLaughlin's departure, a number of friends gathered at the railway depot to bid him farewell. McLaughlin never arrived. His disappearance was a mystery that the RCMP was unable to solve, so the case was closed. Apparently, however, Professor Gladstone did not believe in closed cases, for after his announcement regarding McLaughlin's murder, he pointed to another man in the audience with a dramatic flourish. "He will find the body," Gladstone shouted, "and I shall be with him when he does." The audience gasped in shock. for the man Gladstone had signaled out was Beachy's off-duty RCMP officer, Constable Carey. The audience certainly got their money's worth that night. Even Constable Carey was impressed enough with the Mentalist to call police headquarters in Saskatoon the next morning. He spoke with Corporal Jack Woods and relayed the events of the previous evening. Corporal Woods briefly checked into the Professor Gladstone's reputation and decided to travel to Beachy to reopen the case. After all, he told Constable Carey there might as well take advantage of the sensation that the psychic's revelation had created. If people were once again talking about McLaughlin's disappearance, the RCMP would do well to listen. The morning after Corporal Woods arrived in town, he and Constable Carey took Professor Gladstone on a tour of Beachy's farming community. One by one, they knocked at the rough-hewn doors of simple log shacks on snowbound homesteads. Throughout the day, they listened to the same useless speculation that they had heard nearly 3 years before. But late in the afternoon, when they were about to give up, something new came to light. A normally tight-lipped farmer who was impressed by Gladstone's abilities gave the two officers a new lead. He admitted that there had been one time when McLaughlin's partner, John Schumacher, had visited him while in a terrible rage. The farmer didn't know why Schumacher was angry, but said that he had at one point claimed he would someday kill the damned Scotsman. Prompted by the new bit of information, the Mounties and the mind reader drove out to Sean Schumacher's farm that same night. As the man drove to Schumacher's yard, Professor Gladstone's senses snapped to attention. "Scotty McLaughlin's body is around here somewhere," he said. "I know it. If John Schumacher also knew it, though, he was admitting nothing." He simply repeated the story he had told at the time of his partner's disappearance. Scotty McLaughlin had wanted to leave for British Columbia, he said. He had paid Scotty a few $100s in cash for his share of the land. He had never seen Scotty again. He had no idea where he was. Woods and Carey were suspicious and began to ask John Schumacher more pointed questions. The farmer became stubbornly silent. There seemed to be a solid impasse, when suddenly Professor Gladstone spoke. "I'll tell you what happened," the psychic said excitedly. "Scotty went over to the barn. You followed him and started a quarrel. There was a fight and Scotty fell. You struck and struck and struck, then you buried his body near the barn." John Schumacher blanched, but said nothing. His silence would not buy him much more time. However, a group of men arrived at his farm the next morning, along with the two RCMP officers and Professor Gladstone. They gathered near the barn and awaited Gladstone's instructions. The professor concentrated for a few moments, then directed the men to a pile of frozen manure. "Under there you'll find all the remains of Scotty," he said. The men took hold of their picks and shovels and began to dig. 2 hours later, hands were numb and the group was beginning to lose faith. Then suddenly one of the men unearthed a woolen sock. The excitement of the find re-energized the diggers, and soon an entire skeleton had been excavated. Shreds of rotting clothes hung to the bones. It was enough to solve the case. "It's Scotty all right," one man shouted. "I'd know that scarf and mackinaws anywhere." It was agreed that the clothing had belonged to Scotty McLaughlin. The skull dug up from beneath the manure pile showed 3 distinct fractures. John Schumacher was confronted with the new evidence and finally admitted his guilt. He had murdered his partner and gotten away with it, until Professor Gladstone came to town. John Schumacher was convicted and sentenced in the Kinserly courtroom, and the RCMP was able to close the case for good. As for Professor Gladstone, he enjoyed tremendous publicity following the case and performed on the stage for many years. However, he was never again able to duplicate the drama of his show at Beachy that December night in 1932. This story takes place in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, the Phantom Phone Calls. In 1990, a 40-year-old divorced woman named Brenda moved to Yorkton with her 2 teenage daughters. They rented a 3-bedroom bungalow in a quiet neighborhood and started their new lives. Brenda settled into her job at a local hotel, and the girls attended school and made friends. There were times, in fact, when Brenda felt that her daughters had entirely too many friends. Girls that age, they were 14 and 17, are on the phone a lot, Brenda said, with the voice of experience. There were times I'd try to phone home to check in on them after school. All I'd get for hours was a busy signal. Brenda's daughters, who were outgoing and friendly, received as many calls as they made. Evenings were routinely punctuated by the sound of the ringing telephone and the sisters racing each other to answer it. It got to the point where I made some rules limiting phone time. I had the girls tell their friends that they were not call here after 9:30 p.m. One night, not long after the telephone rules were implemented, the phone rang at 11 p.m. Brenda stumbled out of bed and put on her robe. By the time she got to the hallway, she could hear her older daughter saying goodbye and hanging up the receiver. Annoyed at having been awakened, Brenda demanded to know who had called. Her daughter replied that it had been a wrong number. "Are you sure?" Brenda asked suspiciously. The girl was indignant. "Of course I'm sure," she replied. "It was some man looking for someone named Charlotte. He sounded pretty confused. I think he might have been drunk." 2 weeks later, the girl's story was confirmed when the same disoriented man called again. This time, the younger daughter answered. As Brenda set the table for dinner, she could hear the girl patiently explaining, "No, there's no one here by that name. No, I'm not Charlotte. What number are you trying to dial?" Brenda went into the living room and took the phone from her daughter's hand. "Who's calling, please?" She spoke into the receiver, but found that the caller was no longer there. The line had gone dead. It was around that time that Brenda began to disconnect the phone at night. When she worked the day shift, she had to be on the job at 7 a.m. and didn't need any accidental calls disturbing her sleep. For weeks, it was a plan that worked well. Then in the very early hours of one morning, Brenda was pulled out of a deep sleep by the sound of the ringing phone. She struggled into her bathrobe and swore at herself for forgetting to unplug the cord. As she stumbled down the dark hallway, she vaguely wondered why her daughters weren't out of bed and running to answer the call. "It's because the bell sounds strange," she thought, "kind of flat. Maybe it's broken." Brenda sat down in the armchair by the phone table and picked up the receiver, all the while wondering if it might not feel luxurious to have a non-functional telephone for a few days. In the midst of her fantasy, she mumbled a sleepy hello. The voice on the line was distant and toneless. "Charlotte? Who is this?" Brenda found that her telephone etiquette was lacking at 3 a.m. "Charlotte?" The man sounded more faint the second time. Before Brenda could respond, it was obvious that the call was over. There had been a low hum on the line that ended abruptly. Brenda leaned over and hung up the phone. She then reached behind the table to unplug the set from the wall jack and froze. After a moment, she traced her fingers down the dangling telephone cord to the small plastic plug on the end. The phone had not been connected after all. There was no sleep for Brenda the rest of that night. A few hours later, at the breakfast table, she sounded as casual as possible when she asked their daughters if they had heard the phone ring during the night. Both shook their heads no. Brenda said nothing else to the girls, but that same day she had their number changed and their telephone set replaced. Thankfully, there were no more calls. Several years later, after the girls began attending university in Regina, and Brenda had moved into a small condominium, there was a reminder of that eerie incident. At a work-related social function, Brenda was introduced to someone who had once lived in the neighborhood where she had rented the bungalow. When she described the location of the house, the man nodded in recognition. "I know the place," he said. "You were living in Charlotte and Ben's old house. I heard that she sold it just after he died." the color drained from Brenda's face as she realized what must have happened. It was so strange but obvious, she later said. This woman named Charlotte sold her house and moved without leaving a forwarding number for her poor departed hubby. It makes one wonder if the people who inherited Brenda's old telephone number ever received strange calls in the middle of the night. This story takes place on a farm near Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. The Green-Eyed Girl. In 1973, hitchhiking was still a popular way to travel. Most young people thought nothing of sticking out their thumbs to get from point A to point B, and many drivers were still willing enough to oblige them. For a 17-year-old boy named Daryl, who lived on his family's farm near Meadow Lake, things were a little different though. Daryl's parents were wise enough to recognize the danger of being in a vehicle with a stranger, and they strictly forbade their children from ever hitchhiking or picking up hitchhikers. To break the rules was to lose their driving privileges, which meant social death for a rural teenager. Usually it was a pretty easy rule to follow, said Daryl, but there was one incident that qualified as a notably strange exception. It was a warm night in August, and Daryl had been at a party with a group of his friends. By the time he had taken two of his buddies home and had turned back on the road towards his parents' farm, it was well after 2 a.m. Still, Daryl recalls being wide awake. I had the truck window rolled down all the way, and I remember smelling the night air and wishing that I had somewhere else to go. There was a full moon. It was beautiful, and I was really up, really aware of my surroundings. As Daryl turned a blind corner on the quiet secondary highway, he was alarmed to see that he wasn't the only early morning traveler. Walking toward him along the shoulder of the road was a young woman. She was wearing this sort of flowing hippie-style dress, said Daryl. She had long, straight brown hair and bare feet. I remember the bare feet because I had this fleeting thought that the gravel must have hurt. But then she looked up at me, and every single thought went out of my head. For one moment, the girl made eye contact with Daryl. It was a moment that he remembered well, more than 25 years after it occurred. She had the most incredible green eyes that I'd ever seen. They were beautiful. They were beautiful. I was in love. In love or not, Daryl was still a fairly obedient 17-year-old boy who drove on for a few seconds, grappling with his emotions. It didn't take long to formulate a rationalization. I thought that technically the girl wasn't hitchhiking, so it might be okay. Also, it would have been miles to walk to the nearest farm, and what if she was in trouble? Armed with excuses for breaking his parents' rule, Daryl turned the truck around, drove to the corner where he had seen the girl, and then past it, and was extremely confused. Although no more than 3 or 4 minutes had passed, the lovely young woman was nowhere to be seen. There was really no place for someone to hide along the deserted road that was bordered by fields. Daryl stopped the truck, got out, and looked around. The only thing obstructing his view was the high knoll by the turn in the highway, and he had just seen that from both sides in such a short span of time the girl could not have walked far. Still, it was obvious that she was gone. Bewildered and disappointed, Daryl climbed back into the cab of the pickup and turned the truck around. Once more he rounded the blind corner as he headed home, and once more he saw her. She was in the same place, just walking toward me along the side of the road. I couldn't believe it. She had not been there a couple of minutes earlier. Again the girl looked up and met Daryl's gaze. Again he was astounded by the beauty of her green eyes. But this time there was something different about them. They held a flicker of recognition. When she looked at me, okay, it was only for a couple of seconds, but she looked amused or something. And then she got this little smile on her face, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't nice. I could just feel the hair on my arms and on the back of my neck standing up, and I can tell you I was spooked. Daryl didn't even consider stopping. He hit the gas pedal and sped away, allowing himself only one brief look in the rearview mirror. Behind him, in the moonlight, he could see nothing but road. It was an experience and a mystery that Daryl would never forget. It wasn't until years later, however, that he recognized how strange one element of the story was. The moon was bright, he said, but still, it was night, and that woman was outside my truck, several yards away from me. Each time I saw her, it was only for a few seconds. So how could I have noticed such a small detail as her eye color? But I still remember those green eyes so vividly. It is chilling to think of what might have happened all those years ago had Daryl offered a ride to the beautiful young woman with the hypnotic emerald gaze. This story takes place in Melfort, Saskatchewan, the rocking chair baby. A woman named Kathy, who lives in Melfort, Saskatchewan, had only one regret when she was expecting her first child. "I wish that my mother could have been there to share the experience with me," she said. "My husband and I had been trying to get pregnant for a long time, and before we did manage to conceive, Mum passed away. So as happy as I was about the baby, there was this little sad part of me that just wished she could have known about it." Kathy consoled herself by taking a few things that had been left to her by her mother out of storage. Among the cherished items was a maple rocking chair, which was placed in the nursery. It seemed to Kathy to be a way of including her mother in the preparations for the baby. It was nice to have it in there. When I was decorating the room, I'd often take a break and just rock in the chair for a while. I felt close to my mom and close to my baby. It was like we were all there together. Eventually, Kathy would come to suspect that her mother was there even when she and her unborn child were not. One afternoon, as Kathy was walking down the hall past the nursery, she spotted some movement out of the corner of her eye. She backed up a step, glanced in the room, and noticed that her mother's maple rocking chair was moving ever so slightly. "The window was open a little, so I blamed it on that," she remembered. There was no breeze that day, but it was the only logical explanation. She didn't give the incident another thought until one evening when her husband mentioned something to her. "He said that we might want to level out the floor in the baby's room before replacing the carpet," said Kathy. "When I asked him why he thought so, he told me that it was obviously on a slant because he'd seen the rocking chair move by itself." The next day, out of curiosity, Kathy took a level out of the household toolbox and walked into the baby's room. She set the instrument on several different spots on the floor, including the place where the rocking chair normally sat. Every time the bubbles lined up exactly even. There was nothing wrong with the floor in the room, and Kathy was starting to think that the rocking chair did have a mind of its own. Perhaps more accurately, she thought that her mother, who most definitely had a strong mind of her own, was still enjoying the use of her rocking chair. "It was a strange feeling, but not a bad one," said Kathy. "In fact, it was comforting. I went into the nursery as often as ever and sat in that chair, and thought about my mother and my baby. When there was no one around to think that I was a lunatic, I would talk out loud to both of them." As Kathy's pregnancy progressed and she spent more and more time relaxing in the nursery, the spiritual presence became more pronounced. One night, as she made a trip to the bathroom, she saw the rocker making more movement than ever before. Amazed, she watched the chair for several minutes as it moved back and forth. Eventually, it slowed and came to a stop. Another night, she saw something in the room that appeared to be a faint mist. There was no color or light to the form, but what she would later describe as a sort of simmering or thickening of the air. Objects behind the shape seemed to be distorted. Again, the phenomenon lasted a minute or two and then vanished. Again, Kathy was awed, but not the least bit frightened. I knew that whatever it was not going to harm us, and frankly, I had a really strong feeling that it was my mother. Kathy kept her really strong feeling to herself, however. Fearing that no one else would believe her or appreciate the significance of what was happening, she never shared her stories, not even her husband knew. Interestingly, the spiritual activity only lasted for a few months after Kathy gave birth to a baby girl and brought her home. There were no more strange happenings in the nursery. The rocking chair remained still, and no mysterious rippling shapes ever again appeared. Kathy felt an empty space in the room. Something had vanished. Kathy began to feel she knew why, when her baby grew into a chubby toddler. "My daughter looks a lot like my mom," she said, when the girl was 3 years old. "I've never been too sure if I believed in reincarnation, but you never know. It would be nice if it was true." There was no way of knowing if Kathy's daughter is the reincarnated spirit of her mother. What does seem certain is this: for a few months the spirit of Kathy's mother was present, and the two shared a very special time in the younger woman's life.